Every single day, roughly 30 million American children sit down to eat a school lunch. A small carton of milk, a scoop of mashed potatoes, a piece of processed meat, maybe some canned corn on the side. Most parents assume someone designed this meal with their child's health in mind. A nutritionist maybe, a government health committee, someone who looked at the science and built a program around what growing kids actually need. What if I told you that's not what happened? What if the school lunch your child eats today, the one funded by taxpayer money, served in a government program, approved by federal agencies, was designed not by doctors or scientists, but by industries that needed to get rid of food they couldn't sell anywhere else? And what if the government didn't just allow it? They actively helped make it happen. This is the story of how the American school lunch program was built. Who built it? What they were really trying to accomplish? And why, 70 years later, the system looks almost exactly the same as the day it was created. Part 1. Before the program. What school lunch actually looked like. To understand what happened, you need to go back to a time before school lunch was a federal program at all. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, school lunch in America was chaotic. Some kids brought food from home. Some bought meals from vendors outside the school gates. Some ate nothing at all. In poor urban areas, children were showing up to school visibly malnourished. Teachers reported kids falling asleep in class, fainting during lessons, unable to concentrate on anything because they hadn't eaten since the day before. Reformers and educators began pushing for a solution, not because they were idealists, but because they were practical. A hungry child cannot learn, and if children can't learn, they can't work. And if they can't work, the economy suffers. The argument for school lunch wasn't primarily humanitarian, it was economic. And that framing food as a tool for productivity, rather than as a right, would shape everything that came after. Private charities and local governments began setting up cafeterias in schools across the country. Through the early 1900s, the meals were simple: soups, bread, basic vegetables, cheap, filling, and designed around what kids actually needed to function. And for a while, it worked. Then, World War II happened, and everything changed. Part 2. The war changes everything. When America entered World War II in 1941, military recruiters began processing millions of young men for service. What they found shocked them. A significant portion of the men being drafted were rejected, not for lack of courage or fitness, but because they were malnourished, stunted growth, vitamin deficiencies, bodies that had never received adequate nutrition during childhood. The military called it a national security crisis. And they weren't wrong. If the next generation of American soldiers couldn't fight because they'd been underfed as children, that was a strategic problem. A problem that needed a federal solution. In 1946, President Harry Truman signed the National School Lunch Act into law. The language of the act was clear. The program existed, quote, as a measure of national security, not as a measure of child welfare, not as a measure of public health, as a measure of national security. The framing matters, because it tells you exactly who this program was designed to serve, and it wasn't the children. Part 3. The surplus problem nobody talks about. Here's the part of the story that gets left out of every history textbook. By the mid-1940s, American agriculture had a serious problem. During the war, the government had encouraged farmers to produce as much food as possible. More wheat, more corn, more beef, more dairy. The military needed it. The war effort demanded it. But when the war ended and demand dropped suddenly, farmers were left with massive surpluses. More food than the civilian market could absorb, more food than could be sold at profitable prices. Normally, in a free market, prices would fall. Farmers would produce less. The market would correct itself. But American agriculture wasn't operating in a free market. It was operating in a heavily subsidized system where the government had made promises to farmers. Price supports, minimum payments, guaranteed income. Promises that were politically impossible to break. So, the government had a problem. Farmers were producing more food than anyone could buy. The government was legally obligated to support the prices of that food, and the bill was getting enormous. The school lunch program offered a solution. Instead of letting surplus commodities rot in government warehouses, they could be funneled into schools. The government would buy the excess from farmers at supported prices, solving the surplus problem, and children would eat it, solving the lunch problem. It looked like a win for everyone. But look at it more carefully. The meals being served weren't designed around what children needed nutritionally. They were designed around what the government happened to have too much of. Too much beef this quarter? Beef shows up in school cafeterias. Dairy surplus getting out of control? Schools are required to serve milk. To this day, every federally funded school lunch in America must include a carton of milk. whether the child can tolerate lactose or not. Grain surplus hitting record levels, processed grain products fill the menu. The children weren't the customers. They were the disposal system. Part 4. The industries move in. If you think what happened next was an accident, you haven't been paying attention. Once the school lunch program was established, and the government was purchasing massive quantities of food for schools, the food industry recognized something important. 30 million captive consumers, eating 5 days a week, funded by federal money, with purchasing decisions made not by parents, but by bureaucrats. Bureaucrats who could be lobbied, influenced, and in some cases, directly employed by the industries they were supposed to regulate. The meat industry mobilized first. The National Livestock and Meat Board, the lobbying arm of the American beef industry, began funding nutrition education materials that were distributed directly to schools. Worksheets, posters, lesson plans, all of them teaching children that meat was the foundation of a healthy diet. All of them produced by an industry that sold meat. The dairy industry followed the same playbook. The American Dairy Association pumped money into school nutrition programs, lobbied for milk to be a mandatory component of every federally funded lunch, and funded research that consistently found dairy to be essential for growing children. But it also wasn't independent, and the line between nutrition science and industry marketing had become impossible to see. By the 1950s, the school cafeteria had become one of the most effective marketing platforms in the country. Children were being taught from the age of 5 that certain foods were healthy by the industries that produced and sold those foods, and they were paying for the privilege with taxpayer money. Part 5. The 4 food groups and the most successful marketing campaign in history. In 1956, the United States Department of Agriculture introduced something that would shape the eating habits of generations of Americans. The basic 4 food groups: meat, dairy, grains, fruits, and vegetables. Every American child learned this. It was on posters in every classroom. It was in every health textbook. It was taught as settled nutritional science. But here's what the USDA didn't tell you. The 4 food groups weren't designed by independent nutritional scientists. They were designed with heavy input from the meat and dairy industries, the same industries that stood to benefit most from a government recommendation that said Americans should eat meat and drink milk every single day. Documents later obtained through Freedom of Information requests showed that industry representatives had direct access to the development process. They reviewed drafts. They suggested changes. They pushed back on recommendations they didn't like. And the final product, the nutritional gospel taught to every American child for decades, reflected their priorities more than it reflected the science. Independent researchers at the time had data suggesting that the emphasis on animal products was overstated, that plant-based proteins were equally viable. That dairy consumption, particularly for adults, wasn't the nutritional necessity it was being presented as. That research was minimized, criticized, in some cases, actively suppressed by industry-funded counter-research. The 4 food groups remained official government policy until 1992, when they were quietly replaced by the food pyramid, which had its own problems, but that's a different video. Part 6. What happened to the vegetables? Here's a question worth asking. If the school lunch program existed to feed children nutritious food, why did the vegetable component consistently end up being the weakest part of the meal? The answer is simple, and it's not flattering. Vegetables don't have powerful lobbying organizations. There is no National Broccoli Board pumping money into government nutritional guidelines. No Spinach Industry Association funding research that finds leafy greens essential to national security. Fresh vegetables are also harder to manage at scale. They spoil. They require preparation. They can't be processed into shelf-stable products that sit in government warehouses for months. Canned vegetables could. And so, the vegetables that did make it onto school lunch trays were overwhelmingly canned, sodium-laden, nutritionally compromised versions of the fresh produce they were supposed to represent. The result was a meal that looked balanced on paper, but functioned nutritionally quite differently than intended. In 1981, the Reagan administration made this dynamic almost impossible to ignore. In an attempt to cut costs in the school lunch program, the administration proposed that ketchup, the condiment, be classified as a vegetable for the purposes of school lunch nutrition requirements. The proposal was eventually withdrawn after public outrage, but the fact that it was proposed at all tells you everything you need to know about how the program viewed the vegetable requirement, not as a nutritional necessity, as a box to be checked, as cheaply as possible. Part 7. The pizza moment. In 2011, something happened that became a symbol of everything wrong with the school lunch program. The Obama administration, as part of a broader initiative to improve school nutrition, proposed new guidelines that would have increased the amount of vegetables required in school lunches and reduced the amount of starchy foods like pizza and French fries. Congress pushed back, and in a spending bill passed at the end of 2011, lawmakers included a provision that classified pizza as a vegetable. Specifically, that 2 tablespoons of tomato paste on a pizza counted toward a child's daily vegetable requirement. The provision was written with direct input from the frozen food industry and the salt industry, both of which stood to lose money if the stricter guidelines passed. The result? A frozen pizza with a thin layer of tomato sauce, served in a school cafeteria, counted as a vegetable serving in a federally funded nutrition program. The children eating it had no idea. The parents sending them to school had no idea. And the industries that made it happen spent millions of dollars making sure the conversation stayed as quiet as possible. Part 8. The chocolate milk debate and what it reveals. There's a smaller story inside the school lunch story that perfectly captures how the whole system works. Chocolate milk. In most American schools, children are offered a choice at lunch. White milk or chocolate milk. Seems harmless. A small indulgence that gets kids to drink milk they might otherwise refuse. But look at what's actually in that chocolate milk. A standard school chocolate milk carton contains added sugar, sometimes as much as a full candy bar's worth. It's been flavored, sweetened, and engineered specifically to appeal to children who would otherwise choose water or juice. When researchers and nutritionists began pushing to remove chocolate milk from school lunch programs, on the reasonable grounds that added sugar has no place in a nutrition program, the dairy industry responded with a full lobbying campaign. Their argument, if chocolate milk is removed, kids will stop drinking milk entirely. Dairy consumption will drop. Children will miss out on calcium. The campaign worked. Chocolate milk stayed. What the dairy industry didn't mention, there are multiple other sources of calcium that don't come with a candy bar's worth of sugar. That children in countries without mandatory school milk programs are not calcium deficient. That the argument was designed to protect market share, not children's health. But the argument didn't need to be nutritionally airtight. It just needed to be politically effective. And it was. Part 9. Where are we now? In 2010, Michelle Obama launched the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, the most significant overhaul of the school lunch program in decades. New standards for fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and sodium limits. Real, meaningful changes to what was being served to children every day. Schools struggled to implement it. Food costs went up. Some children refused the new options. The food industry lobbied aggressively against the changes, funding studies that showed participation in school lunch programs dropping and children going hungry. In 2017, the Trump administration began rolling back several of the stricter requirements, citing flexibility for schools and cost concerns. The sodium limits were delayed, the whole grain requirements were loosened, and the cycle continued. As of today, the school lunch program serves over 30 million children daily. It distributes billions of dollars of food annually, and it remains one of the most heavily lobbied food programs in the federal government. The meals have improved from where they started. Nobody disputes that. But the fundamental architecture of the program, food chosen based on what industries need to sell, nutritional guidelines shaped by the industries they're supposed to regulate, and a system that treats children as consumers of last resort for surplus commodities. That architecture hasn't changed. It was built in a specific way, for specific reasons, by people with specific interests, and it has been remarkably resistant to change. Part 10. What you can do. This isn't a story about inevitability. It's a story about how systems get built and who gets to build them. The school lunch program has been reformed before. The 2010 changes proved that meaningful improvement is possible when there's enough public pressure to overcome industry lobbying. Schools that have invested in fresh, locally sourced food programs have seen real results. Better attendance, better concentration, better academic performance. The research exists. The solutions exist. What hasn't existed consistently is the political will to prioritize children over commodity markets. And that political will doesn't come from Washington. It comes from parents, teachers, and communities that understand what's actually on the tray and why it got there. Now, you know the story.